What was the impact of the Depression on the USA? The Great Depression started in October or sometime after October 1929 when the stock market in the USA crashed and stock prices fell dramatically. The first major impact of the Depression on the USA was unemployment. Unemployment increased massively. By 1933, 25% of Americans did not have a job. So 25% of those who could work did not have a job and didn't have much chance of getting one. This is 1 in 4 people without a job. Now, because that is such a stark figure, there's certain things in the USA you need to be aware of at that time anyway. So, for example, the fact there's no social security, no benefits. This leads to a whole range of factors and problems that came about because of this. So one of those is the fact that people became homeless, and some of them ended up in so-called Hoovervilles. A Hooverville was a shack basically built out of sometimes cardboard but also corrugated metal. And lots of these kind of shanty towns consisting of Hoovervilles sprung up all across the USA, and they were built just outside cities like New York or Washington, where thousands of homeless people actually lived. And this unemployment rate of 25%, it not only led to people being homeless, but it also led to people being hungry. And so we actually had these things called bread lines, and a bread line was literally a line of unemployed men, because they were the breadwinners at that time in 1933, queuing up for free bread and free soup. And charities like the YMCA and the Red Cross used to organise these bread lines where you could get free bread and soup. And it was, Americans at that time, getting charity wasn't something that any of them wanted to do. And they had this proud tradition of rugged individualism, the idea that Americans can overcome problems and won't need government handouts. But in fact, the complete opposite came to apply there with the bread lines. You also had hobos. Hobos were unemployed men who travelled on trains from town to town across America looking for jobs. It was a desperate search. They used to sleep in hay barns, anywhere they could find, basically. They had one set of clothes that they wore all the time. They were basically desperate people. This kind of homelessness we mentioned with the Hoovervilles, the Wall Street crash and the stock market crashing actually led to banking failures. So it wasn't just lack of money that was causing all these problems here. It was also the fact that lots of people lost their pre-existing savings. So when banks crashed, some people had money stashed there, money saved. The banks failed, and they lost that money. So all in all, it was a really difficult time to live in the USA. In fact, most historians will agree that the depression that came about because of the Wall Street crash was the worst in the 21st century. Also happening at the same time, rather unfortunately, to all that, was the Dust Bowls. The Dust Bowls affected farmers, particularly in the south of the United States. They were caused by drought, and whole clouds of dust descended over large farming areas in the USA, in southern states. These massive dust storms created whole areas where things could not be grown. Farmers were put out of business. They had to leave their farms. In fact, some farms were completely covered in dust. They physically ceased to exist. So these farmers actually had to leave those areas, and travel to other areas. So, for example, a lot of them actually ended up going to California. Were they welcome in California? Well, not really. In fact, a lot of those from Oklahoma got the nickname of Okies. Okies, and those from Arkansas got the nickname of Arkies. The Okies and Arkies invading California, which is obviously well known for its orange growing and other kind of fruit farming. These farmers were not welcome at a time when they were already pushed to make the money that they needed to. The Dust Bowls carried on really all the way through the 1930s, and it's really unfortunate that these two, the Wall Street crash, that led into the Great Depression from 1930 onwards, also happened at the same time as the Dust Bowls. So that's just two aspects of it. Massive unemployment, but also you've got these Dust Bowls, which is affecting farmers as well. So it's not just industrial workers, it's also people working in rural areas and communities. The political consequences of all this, I mean, I mentioned the word Hoovervilles. Herbert Hoover was the president of the United States at this time, from 1928 to 1932. And he was actually blamed in a lot of circles for not doing enough to tackle the problems. And he was given the nickname the Do-Nothing President. The Do-Nothing President. Was that fair? Well, not really, because Hoover did actually try to pass several laws to help businesses and banks recover from the Depression, but ultimately these were unsuccessful, and therefore you got people, as I say, naming these shanty towns after him. You also got, also in addition to that, you had things like, the Hoover blankets, which were newspapers that people used as blankets, and they came up with that nickname, the Hoover blanket. The Hoover stew, is the free stew that was given out on the bread line. So he was ridiculed, really, as a president who wasn't dealing with the problem of the Depression effectively when it kicked in from 1929, 1930 onwards. One particularly unsavoury event for him happened in 1932, when a group of Army veterans, who were nicknamed the Bonus Army, marched to Washington, D.C., demanding a bonus that they were owed for fighting in World War I. Hoover said, "You're not having the bonus," and he set the army on them. And in fact, in the ruckus and the riot that followed, a baby actually got killed, and lots of other protesters were injured. They were beaten with batons, water cannons were used, shots were fired, and the army used really heavy-handed tactics against them. It was a really divisive moment in America, and really the message was coming out was this president doesn't care about the people. It was unfair. It was unfair really on Hoover, who watched it all from the Oval Office in dismay. But ultimately it still happened. It still happened. And really that was a big turning point, because in November 1932, the election was coming up. And of course, one of the major candidates in that election was FDR. So you might actually, Roosevelt was one of the candidates in that election. And because of everything I've just described, and the fact that a lot of the blame was put onto Hoover personally, Roosevelt was able to win a landslide victory in that election. A landslide victory. I think 90% of states in America actually voted for Roosevelt in that election. It's a huge, huge win. And I suppose that's one of the results. That's one of the impacts, is the political situation changed in America. Hoover lost his job. Hoover, who believed in rugged individualism, one of the things that we mentioned earlier. This idea that Americans should be able to deal with the problems without resorting to charity. He was a self-made millionaire himself, Hoover. So he thought that this was very feasible and possible. He made his money in mining. So for him, this idea of the government helping the American population. Well, he didn't get help, so why should they get help? Why should they need help? But actually they did. They did need it. There was no other option for a lot of them. And he also believed in this idea of laissez-faire. Laissez-faire. And that was really an economic idea, and it literally means hands-off. This hands-off approach, no government intervention should be happening. And of course he was a Republican president as well, so that came naturally to him anyway. The idea that the government should not be getting involved in people's business, both as individuals, but also on a national level as well. So the results were far-reaching, and what we're going to do in a future tutorial is obviously look at what Roosevelt tried to do when he started his job in February 1933. So how did he actually deal with this situation where you had 13 million people out of work? What was he going to do to get those people back into work and to make this situation better?